Supreme Court appears poised to strike down the landmark Roe v. Wade decision that has guaranteed the right to abortion since 1973. That's according to a leaked draft opinion from February published online by Politico that the Chief Justice this morning confirmed as authentic, while warning it is not final. Demonstrations on both sides came swiftly. Today, an abortion rights opponent made a statement in San Francisco in dramatic fashion. This free climber scaled 61 stories of Salesforce Tower. He made it nearly 1,100 feet to the top, where SFPD officers then took him into custody. Meantime, the Women's March has called on supporters to hit the streets across the country. In Washington, hundreds of abortion rights activists are taking the fight directly to the Supreme Court Plaza. San Francisco's main rally will take place at 5 p.m. at Market and Powell Streets. Joining us to talk about the future of reproductive rights in the U.S., this particular Supreme Court, congressional options, and her own personal story on abortion is Peninsula Congresswoman Jackie Speier. Congresswoman Speier, thank you for joining us today.
Great to be with you, Kristen, although sad topic to be talking about.
When you heard about it last night, when the draft opinion was first leaked, were you surprised or not surprised?
I don't know that I was surprised, but I was dumbfounded. I had such a visceral reaction to it because I know the pain and suffering that is going to ensue for young women and older women in this country. You know, we forget that 57% of the women who get abortions are mothers. And clearly 25% of women before the age of 45 will have an abortion. It is a safe medical procedure that has been a right that women have had in this country for almost 50 years. And to have that taken away from us is mind-blowing. It is something that I can't even get my hands around. Now, here in California, women and young girls are going to be safe because we have really strong protections. But across the country, 90% of the counties in this country do not have a clinic to provide abortion services.
Once upon a time, you had an abortion, and you tweeted last night that it saved your life in more ways than one. How so?
Well, it was a painful experience, and certainly no one wants to have an abortion. I was, pregnant with our second child. It was 17 weeks. It was a second trimester abortion, and it was a failing fetus, and it had slipped from my uterus into my vagina, and efforts to try and get it to be slipped back into my uterus failed. And so I made the decision, along with my spouse, to terminate the pregnancy. It was a horrible experience, but it was the right thing to do for me at that point in time. And every woman has the right to make that decision personally. It's about personal autonomy, about having control over your own body. If you read the opinion, this draft opinion by Justice Alito, he's basically saying this decision should be made by the men in state legislatures across this country, because the majority of members in state legislatures are men. That does not make any sense. And so I think that because we've had it as a right for so long, I think a lot of women don't appreciate that this is about to be taken away from us.
Speaking of men, you also mentioned needing to be an impregnator responsibility. What does that mean? What do you mean by that?
No, the truth of the matter is that when we look at abortion, it is looked upon as if there was immaculate conception, like this is something that was caused by the woman. I mean, it takes two to create an embryo, and yet we don't talk about any responsibilities of the impregnator. And I've said over and over again on the House floor, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are all pro-birth, but they're not pro-life. It's like they want this fetus to turn into a young infant, but then the resources to provide for that infant, to make sure it has the health care and the nutrition it needs to make it, is not something they want to deal with. And yet so many of these abortions that are not allowed to happen end up with a poor woman without the resources having to care for this new infant.
I want to be clear, if Roe is struck down, it does not mean abortion will be banned across the country. It'll be kicked back to the states, and certainly in states like California, there will still be every protection. In fact, it's being expanded. But there will be about, correct me if I'm wrong, about half the states that will either make it illegal or almost illegal. And I understand states are moving in that direction now. Missouri's trigger law will criminalize residents seeking abortions in other states too, meaning, you know, they can come to California to try to get an abortion, but then does that mean when they go back to Missouri, they can be prosecuted? Can you see that happening?
You know, it's draconian, and most of these states that are, you know, promoting this kind of a program are doing so because they just want to ratchet up the hatred by those that want to take this right away from women. There's 13 states that have what are called trigger laws, which means they've already passed the law that says that if Roe versus Wade is overturned, it's automatically going to be prohibited in their states. Another 13 states have indicated that they would follow suit very quickly. So half the states would in fact prevent women from accessing abortion. Some at 6 weeks, some at 15 weeks. And there will be this move to try and get to the lowest common denominator, as we've seen in Texas and then other states that have now copycatted that law, which basically creates a bounty for anyone who kind of calls out someone who is assisting a woman getting an abortion.
Like the content of this possible decision, if it becomes final, is what many Democrats have been criticizing. But on the other side of the aisle, your Republican colleagues and Chief Justice Roberts today mainly focusing on the fact that there was a leak at all. In fact, Mitch McConnell, Senate Minority Leader, saying what's unique about today is this is the first time we've had somebody on the inside try to attack the institution. What's your response to that?
I think it's a lot of hyperbole and an effort to distract from what is really happening here. This is a monumental rejection of women's rights in this country. And in an effort to somehow tamp down the anger and frustration, they're focusing in on the leak. I don't know, some have argued that, you know, maybe it was someone on the conservative side that leaked it. Who knows? But who really cares at this point? This is a decision that was being telegrammed by virtue of the kinds of questions being asked by the justices. But it also kind of raises another issue that we should talk about, Kristen, and that is how the actual Supreme Court has become a political institution now. It is no longer this blind justice that is meted out by very thoughtful individuals who are great scholars of the law. They're people that have been plucked out of the Federalist Society and have been tested for whether or not they support a woman's right to choose. So this has been a full-on campaign for decades to get to this place where a minority of Americans want to see a woman's right to have an abortion taken away from her.
In fact, we do have a graphic that shows a new ABC News Washington Post poll on this. 58% of Americans feel abortion should be legal in all or most cases. And 70% say that decision should be left between a woman and her doctor. Only 24% saying it should be regulated by law. I think this is partly what shocks a lot of people, is that there's kind of a disconnect between, you know, the debate that's happening at the judicial level and the attitudes reflected by such a survey. Okay, so let's talk about what the options are. For now, Democrats still have the majority in the House and the Senate, though they are slim majorities. What are the tools you have to try to enshrine this as a fundamental right?
We have no tools. I know that's a little disturbing to hear, but we have passed the Women's Health Protection Act in the House. It was introduced by Congresswoman Judy Chu of Southern California. I'm a co-author of the measure. It passed in the House. It is in the Senate. It was attempted to be taken up in February. It didn't receive the requisite number of votes to cut off debate. There will be some effort to take it up again. There are not 60 votes in the Senate, and as a result, nothing will happen. That's the one thing that you can take to the bank. Congress will not act. So what do we do instead? I'm calling on President Biden to do as much as he can by executive order. And I don't know all of the potential actions he can take, but we've got to start somewhere. And we do know that medication abortion, the pill, is available. You have to jump through hoops in some states to get it. You have to see a doctor. You have to have a prescription. It should be like other over-the-counter products, and it should be made available.
Pardon me, we are so out of time, but I simply must ask you this. To young women, perhaps our daughters, who may wonder, because they are born with a uterus, does that mean they must accept less agency over their bodies, chart the course of their lives? What do you say to them?
I would say to all our daughters and granddaughters, this is a time of personal action. This is a time when each of you are going to have to take up the mantle of your own destiny. And your own destiny is linked to whether or not you have the freedom to make a decision as to whether or not you are going to have an abortion. So it's a 5-alarm fire, and it's really important for all of us to get engaged.
Congresswoman Jackie Speier, thank you so much. Appreciate
Thank you, Chris.
All right, there's a lot more to tackle on abortion from a medical perspective as well. ABC7 News special correspondent Dr. Alok Patel will join us next.
In commercial break.
All right, we'll be right back. Terrible.
6, 5 seconds, 4, 3, 2, 1.
The leaked draft of a Supreme Court opinion on Roe v. Wade has many asking questions about women's health, specifically maternal health. Joining us live to talk about this is ABC7 News special correspondent Dr. Alok Patel. Dr. Patel, should Roe get struck down and abortions become illegal or mostly illegal in about half the states, do you have concerns as a medical doctor?
Kristen, I do. I have concerns on 2 angles. I have concerns on behalf of the medical community, those who are just looking at data and the public health implications of what this would truly mean. I am sincerely concerned. I'm also very concerned on behalf of all the people out there who may become pregnant in an unfavorable situation or something that requires a little bit of a personal situation, a personal assessment, to know that their reproductive rights are in the hands of politicians. I'm worried about them as well. And I'm echoing so many fears that are shared by my colleagues in OB-GYN and those who work directly with women in these situations. I'm concerned all around. I think this sets a terrible precedence about the ability for politicians to govern what happens in the scientific world and with a uterus and reproductive rights. It feels like a very depressing day, Kristen.
Well, what do you fear would happen?
What I essentially fear would happen is that right now there are about 24 states that have some form of an abortion ban in place. And then we have these about 13 states that have a trigger law in place where if Roe v. Wade were to be overturned, then all of a sudden in these states, there's going to be an abortion ban of some effect. And what I worry about is that this is going to disproportionately affect those who may not have the resources, those minority populations, people who are unemployed, who don't have health insurance, who may not be able to fly to a state to go then get an abortion. And Kristen, we're not speaking about people who simply are going to run and say, I don't want to be pregnant, I'm getting an abortion. That completely downplays what actually happens. And the conversations I hear about from my colleagues about how incredibly difficult it is for a family to make this decision, the situations in which a mom's life is at stake, or in which you find out that your growing baby, your fetus has an anomaly after 15 weeks. What do you do in that situation? It's so incredible. The hypotheticals are so incredibly troubling, especially in a state like Mississippi and Ohio, which want to completely outlaw this. Ohio is especially egregious in saying that at conception, a zygote is a human being, and it absolutely takes nothing into account in terms of the mother's health, the family situation. I could go all day about this, but it's very troubling.
We used to think of when is fetal viability, that is the ability to survive outside of the womb, as kind of a cutoff line. But it seems like many states now have cutoff lines well below that, like very early in the pregnancy before many women even find out.
They do, Kristen. And I think it's important that, if we just take a step back away from the politics and we just look at the science, some states have a heartbeat bill, meaning they say that abortion is going to be cut off when we detect a heartbeat. And the heartbeat itself, sometimes at around 6 to 8 weeks of pregnancy, there's a little bit of an electrical impulse in a tube that is then going to develop into the heart. So this electrical impulse is not necessarily the heartbeat that we all define, that we all look at later on with 4 chambers and blood pumping to a brain. It's way before that. And so this then becomes a very difficult argument in saying, well, is that actually a heartbeat? Is it an electrical impulse? And also this really varies on how quickly somebody's able to go to an OB-GYN and get an ultrasound and what the technology looks like in that particular state. There's so many shades of gray.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's some say who, ironically, as science advances and lowers, the viability line, it makes it even harder for women, limits their choices more. But let me ask you, do you see medication-based abortions, we're talking about pills, becoming more popular? And is that a suitable or acceptable alternative?
Yeah, I have heard from my colleagues who are OB-GYNs practicing in Texas that what was actually happening with these, not only with contraception to prevent it altogether, but with early stage abortion medications. And I don't want to go into the specifics about what they're doing over there, but it's definitely a conversation that's happening because, again, there are a situation where people are very early in pregnancy. And then remember, if you say in that situation, I can't be pregnant for a very particular reason, I need to talk with my doctor about this, you then have to get into a doctor, get an ultrasound. This means that you have the insurance to get this done in that tiny time window. I think that's a big consideration here, Kristen. The people who talk about being pro-life and saying this is why they want to restrict abortions, I would then respectfully ask them, what about maternal mortality, child welfare, health insurance, and everything that actually dictates a quality of life after a child is born?
Which I think, you mentioned maternal mortality, it is higher here in the U.S. than in our peer nations, right?
We are currently the highest in maternal mortality out of developed countries. It's absolutely pathetic. And the fact that we are not focusing on that, Kristen, and the vulnerable populations, what actually happens after somebody gets pregnant and how to keep them the healthiest, and instead focusing on abortions at the highest level, it's a complete separation. I look at Mississippi's governor in the statement saying that they want to protect all children's life. Well, there was a report last year ranking Mississippi 50th in terms of child welfare, looking at education, community health, and more. That is a complete disparity between fact and reality and what the actual focus is on.
All right, Dr. Alok Patel, there's so much more we can talk about, but we are out of time for today. But this issue continues, so we'll have the conversation another time. Thank you so much for all that information.
Thank you.
Coming up next, companies are leaving San Francisco in the wake of the pandemic. So why is this still happening? Kevin Trong, a reporter from our media partner, the San Francisco Standard, will be joining us to share this insight, or his insights.
In commercial break.
Throughout the pandemic, we've been tracking the ways workplaces are changing as part of our efforts to build a better Bay Area. Big name companies like Airbnb are bailing on San Francisco and closing local offices. And as we first reported last week here on ABC7 News, PayPal is giving up its offices on Market Street. Our media partners at the San Francisco Standard, they are doing a deep dive into this exodus. Joining us live to talk about what they've learned is reporter Kevin Trong. Kevin, thanks for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so name some of the companies that are leaving or relocating or drastically cutting back on their office space.
Yeah, right. So Airbnb just announced last week that it was moving to a fully distributed remote structure. And that's not that big of a surprise to people who've been tracking its real estate moves. Over the past couple of years, Airbnb has ditched around 400,000 square feet across the city. And they're joining the likes of Block, formerly known as Square, which officially delisted San Francisco as its headquarters location and has moved to a fully distributed structure as well. And go ahead.
Oh, no, that's okay. I was just, hearing about you talking about, distributed work, like people working from home and not necessarily coming to the office. Of course, that reduces the need for office space. But is it more San Francisco specific in that our city seems to be seeing or suffering a bigger share of companies pulling up stakes, if you will?
Yeah, if you look at San Francisco compared to some of the other markets across the country when it comes to the return from office, San Francisco is near the lowest level. So around 35% of office workers in San Francisco has returned. And because of the greater share of technology companies, which are kind of formulated and make it easier to shift to remote work, we have been kind of the poster child for a lot of this transition.
Got it. Is that the main reason, you think, why San Francisco is suffering a bigger share of this? Or do you think there are other factors that are specific to our city as well?
It's interesting when you talk to some of the folks who are working on these issues. They blame business issues like taxes, but they also blame some of the street conditions and public safety issues that have been top of mind for a lot of residents. I spoke to some of the small businesses that are being affected by these changes as well. And they're complaining about a lot of those same issues as well.
So whatever the cause, what is the effect in terms of how it's affecting, for example, the office vacancy rate or the rent?
Right. So office vacancies are at around 25%. Now, that's the highest level ever recorded in San Francisco, higher than the dot-com crash, higher than the Great Recession. Office rents have dipped around 15%. Now, that's not as low as you would expect, because a lot of office landlords are expecting, or hoping rather, that things will be turning around. So that they're kind of keeping prices high for the time being.
Right. And since some workers, a lot of them like to live near where they work, I wonder if this is also affecting the residential rental market. Do we know?
Yeah, so residential rents have recovered somewhat from the pandemic low, but San Francisco used to be the highest in terms of residential rents. It's somewhere around number 3.
Okay.
So still quite pricey, but it has been impacted somewhat.
Look, so how is this going to affect San Francisco in both the near and the long term?
So short term, it's really affecting the businesses that are downtown. A lot of the small businesses, the restaurants, bars, dry cleaners, businesses of that nature really rely on the daily office traffic. And, I spoke to some business owners who say, instead of the work week being Monday through Friday, now it's a little bit more like Tuesday through Thursday. And you can imagine 2 days less of revenue really impacting those businesses.
Well, we only have about 30 seconds, but I am wondering, what is the city doing to try to keep these companies in place?
Well, Mayor London Breed and a lot of her partners in the business community have been really trying to drum up support to bring businesses back. I attended an event last week at Google's newest office, where she really talked about the importance of bringing office workers back and creating more vibrancy. That's kind of the buzzword being used by a lot of policymakers
well,
in
do
downtown.
keep us posted on her efforts to bring back the vibrancy. Thank you so much, Kevin Trong. And we do have links to the Standard's other original reporting on ABC7news.com. To watch more of ABC7 segments featuring the Standard's city-focused journalism, check out our ABC7 Bay Area streaming TV app. We'll be right back. All right. Hey, Kevin. So we have a couple more minutes to finish up our conversation here on Facebook Live, if you've got a couple more minutes free. By the way, that's all really super information and really appreciate it. Any indication yet that the early efforts to drum up business have paid off?
Yeah, there's little in the way of indications of that. But, I think one of the interesting things in the studies on some of this remote work is that there actually is a changing sentiment around remote work. So at the end of 2021, that's when the desire to move to remote really peaked. And we're seeing sort of employee sentiment kind of change a little bit. People wanting to go back to the office, talk to their coworkers, and just be in a little bit more of a social environment as the virus itself has sort of settled down. Okay,
I know this is not the focus of your report, but I am wondering, this is so interesting to me, right, as someone who drives around in the city, works in the city, like why, if companies like these big tech companies, if they're doing 60% in person versus remote, why does it feel like traffic is at 100% as opposed to 60%?
That is a really, really good question. And then I actually looked into the data around this. Traffic on the Bay Bridge especially, and I don't need to tell you, is at exactly the same level as it was pre-pandemic. But BART traffic, Muni traffic are at something like 30%. So it appears to be that the folks wanting to come into the office or able to come into the office are the ones driving into the office. So take that with what it means,
Yeah, I mean, but that in itself is interesting. It's not like we suddenly have a lot more parking spaces or it's suddenly a lot cheaper to park. So anyway, maybe that's the subject of your next investigative report on the economy of the city. Kevin Trong, thank you so much. A pleasure talking with you.
Thank you, Kristen.
All right, everybody, what a day. What a day, what a day. Thanks for watching. Always interesting.
7, 6, 5 seconds, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Thank you so much for joining us on this interactive show, Getting Answers. We'll be here every weekday at 3 on air and on live stream answering your questions. World News Tonight with David Muir is next, and I'll see you back here at 4.